hide from them anymore. What do we do?
Are we not men? Half of it, folks. Today we're looking at Arcadian, which is directed by Ben Brewer. The movie stars Maxwell Jenkins and Jaden Martell, and the man we would all love to have as our uncle, Nicolas Cage. Maybe it's just me. They shot this movie about 2 years ago, roughly an hour and a half away from my house, and when I found out Mr. Cage was in town, I moseyed my way down there and ended up very, very close to the action. You would be surprised what you can do in a film set if you have the right attitude. Arcadian premiered at the South by Southwest Festival 2 months ago, and it hit theaters last month in April. The critics loved this movie, the fans not so much, and I have a little theory as to why. I think it's all about what kind of a story you were expecting to see, and if you saw the trailer, it could have thrown your expectations way off. How about we break down the story and we'll find out if I'm right. The movie opens with Paul, played by Nicolas Cage, After pilfering a handful of random bits and pieces, he steps over a dead body slumped against a wall and heads out fearlessly into the middle of what looks like the end of the world as we know it. There are sirens and explosions and a clattering of chaotic gunfire, and at one point, Paul even runs past a big pile of wrapped up bodies. And you can tell they're bodies because of the excessive buzzing fly sounds. Unfortunately, the handheld camera effect they're using obscures some of the early scenery at times, and this might be a coping strategy to deal with the movie's smaller budget. Eventually, Paul makes his way deep into the countryside where he finds his 2 baby boys tucked away in a shed, and now we know why he was so driven to get through the chaos. We shoot 15 years ahead to find Paul with one of his sons, Joseph, played by Jaden Martell. They're both waiting for Thomas to return, which he does, but not without hearing an earful for coming back so close to dark. And then the trio get to securing the remote farmhouse they're holed up in, and then they sit down together for dinner. For all intents and purposes, they get on like a well-organized, disciplined unit, and when the teenage boys start acting like teenage boys, Father Paul is quick to diffuse the play fighting by reminding them the way men are meant to act. After dinner, Joseph is keen on intellectual pursuits like playing chess against himself, whereas Thomas, on the other hand, can't understand why Joseph bothers. And throughout the entire scene, Father Paul is silently observing them as they interact with each other. This is one aspect of the story you have the option to focus on, and we will talk about this again later. The peace and the quiet does not last long as something starts battering the front door, and from the ferociousness of it, it is no stray dog. Thomas and Paul hold steady against the back of the door while Joseph records stats he's tracking during the attack in hopes they can better understand the behavior of whatever is trying to get in. This is the other aspect of the story you can focus on, and if you saw the trailer, I'm guessing it's probably why you're here. Stick with me for a minute, folks. I assure you I am taking this somewhere. I always take it somewhere. The next morning, the family's out finishing chores around the yard the way any family might without an apocalyptic backdrop. And after only a few minutes into this first act, the shaky cam is starting to steal my attention a little bit more than I would like it to. Thomas asks if he can head off to visit a neighboring farm, and after some consideration, Dad tells him he can go as soon as he's finished his yard work. And then back in the shed, Joseph, the deep thinker of the twins, who appears to cut his hair with rocks maybe, like an Amish kid on Rumspringa? Despite everyone else's hair looking fine, even the dog looks manicured. What was I saying? Young Joseph's been building some sort of ATV from random parts around the farm, and when Paul asks him why he's building it, we find out he thinks it'll help them fight back against whatever is knocking on their doors at night. Joseph's also working on a theory about what's caused everything that's disrupted their lives so directly, and if you're the sort of person who prefers exposition and explanation in your movies, this is about all you're going to get. Joseph theorizes the things trying to get into their home came to punish mankind for its pollution. And if you couple that bit of info with the movie's title, Arcadian, which derives from the 18th century term Arcadianism, which refers to the concept of man living in harmony with nature, then we probably have ourselves a creature feature featuring an environmental statement, folks. Paul's impressed with Joseph's attitude, but he makes sure not to leave his son feeling hopeless. So he explains his belief the worst has already happened. That puts some light at the end of the very long tunnel his children have grown up in. And then Then we find out Thomas' motivation to help the other farm out is the oldest and purest in human history. It turns out there's a lovely young girl there named Charlotte, played by Sadie Soferall. And now that we know why Thomas is constantly late getting home, we're hardly surprised to see this first act brought to a close when he slips, sprinting home in the dark and falling into a crevice that following night. Now, based on the trailer, you'd be right in expecting this to be an action-packed alien invasion post-apocalyptic survival movie. You have no idea how many times I had to... Anyways, to me, that might explain why so many people found the pacing slow. Modern movies operate to a very tight schedule, and normally that means the inciting incident or the event that pushes the characters into the rest of the story typically happens by the 15 to 20 minute point. But Thomas didn't fall into the crevice until the 30th minute, and that's a very long time if you're there to see an action movie. But if you didn't see the trailer, or the fatherhood family dynamic just happened to resonate with you from the start, you might be viewing this story as a movie about a father trying to raise his young sons to be men in impossible circumstances. And if that is the case, you might have seen this opening act as a thorough introduction to the characters, the setting, and the main conflict. Now let's find out if my little theory holds up through Act 2. Act 2 kicks off with Paul heading out to retrieve his son for the second time in the story, and he does, but by the time he gets there, it's too late for them to head back home. Meanwhile, Joseph is playing Macaulay Culkin back at the house. He fakes being asleep and lures one of our monsters into a trap. I really want to show you guys this scene because it's masterfully done and it kept my eyes glued to the screen the entire time, but I'm not going to show you the scene in case you also want your eyes to be glued to the screen the entire time if you end up watching this movie. I know what I mean. Back in the crevice, during a quiet moment, Paul observes his son. And somehow, for me anyways, the short gaze conveys the idea he'd do this for his boys no matter how many times they needed him to. It's a kind of look only a father can give, and only a father would do it at a time like this. And for anyone taking issue with the movie's pacing, you might try giving this a rewatch with your focus specifically on these more subtle moments. And then the father-son team is suddenly swarmed by countless creatures, and Paul is forced to detonate a bomb to save them. The resulting explosion wrecks his arm and knocks him unconscious. The next morning, Joseph uses the ATV to find them, and they bring Dad back to the house. When Thomas finds the creature Joseph trapped, we find out Joseph's hoping to learn from it by studying it. But Thomas isn't having it. He's furious about what just happened to his dad. And yes, you could argue it was his fault entirely, but Thomas is only 15, and he's in love. So they let it out of the cage only to have it scurry under the bed to escape the direct sunlight, and that is a very unique behavior for a movie monster. And when they eventually kill it, Joseph pulls it apart for examination. And that means, without any formal training or education, not only can he build an internal combustion engine and beat previous chess masters at their own game, he's also a forensic pathologist, and yet still not a hairdresser. When the boys realize how serious Dad's condition is, they take him to Charlotte's farm in hopes they can take him in while he's recovering. They have more room, the compound is better protected, and they have medication. But in a strange move, they turn Dad and Joseph away and invite Thomas to stay by himself. Then Joseph accuses Thomas of always putting himself first and suggests that's why their dad is about to die. So they wrestle, the way brothers wrestle. And surprisingly, Thomas does stay. Then Charlotte's father tells Charlotte to take Thomas inside to her room, and she does, and things get exactly the way you'd assume they would with two awkward post-apocalyptic teens. And when Charlotte's dad comes in and sees it, he is surprised for some reason. And after the incident, Thomas scours the place for medicine, but Charlotte finds him looking for it. When she realizes what he's up to, she gives him some to sneak home with. And on his way back to the house, one of the farmhands pulls a shotgun on him, accusing him of theft. And then back at the house, Macaulay Joseph falls into a hole in the living room beneath a rug, and everything finally clicks for the boy genius. The creatures have been distracting them at the front door every night so they can burrow up into the house from underground. And when Joseph figures it out, he starts prepping a trap for them. And then back at the farm again, a group of disgruntled farmhands tie Thomas up and prepare to shoot him. The scene feels unusual and abrupt, given the relationship Thomas seems to have developed with Charlotte's parents. But right before the shooting, one of the farmhands implies Thomas is in the process of replacing him within in the compound. And that leaves me thinking this segment just has some editing issues. Now, if you weren't aware this movie was shot in Ireland already, you certainly will be now. The farmhands hold Thomas still while their friend aims a shotgun at the lot of them as if the pellets wouldn't take all three of them out at the same time. Wait. Before I get a single complaint in the comments section, I'm Irish, born and bred. I can say whatever the fuck I like. Without warning, the creatures break in through the floor and kill everybody. Then they ravage the house next, and Thomas and Charlotte are the only ones to survive. We get to see glimpses of our creatures, and they are very unique and interesting, and as a fan of movie monsters myself, I can say honestly I have never seen anything like them. Good Charlotte and Thomas hightail it back to the house in the dark, somehow unaccosted, and when they get there, Joseph tells them about the traps he's set up. The second act comes to a close as they batten down the hatches to prepare for the final fight. Another complaint about this movie is its lack of explanation. As I mentioned earlier, the only backstory we really get is Joseph's speculation. Now, his speculation, coupled with the movie's title, I'd say we are safe in assuming this movie is pushing an environmental message. Now, backstory is just a personal preference. Some people prefer to have everything explained to them, which is probably why movies like these ones dominate in the box office. Personally, I don't like having everything explained to me. In fact, the best thing you can hear out of my mouth during a movie is probably, "What the fuck?" Now again, if you're watching Arcadian as an action-packed movie, you're probably going to want to know more about the lore of these creatures. Like, why are they here? Or what did we do to deserve annihilation? And there's nothing wrong with wondering those things. Sometimes the lore can be as cool as the creatures themselves. But if you happen to be honed in on the dramatic details affecting the family, the lore does not matter. I would argue if the family don't know the details, you don't need to either. In the grand scheme of things, the second act did its job in cranking up the tension by removing Dad from the equation. The brothers are also at each other's throats, meaning they're losing their cohesion. And finally, they are aware the creatures are evolving and getting smarter. But at the emotional heart of this story, something is trying to wipe out both of Paul's children. He's trying desperately to stop that from happening. Here's Act 3. Dad regains consciousness just in time for the big showdown. As his burnt face is pumping his kids up for the climactic battle, his kick-ass vibes are so strong, I'm wondering if it's an homage to his Big Daddy character. And during this final mini-montage, the movie that's been giving me a mild 28 Days Later vibe uses music very similar to John Murphy's In the House song from 28 Days Later. With the whole gang together in the same room, prepared for absolutely anything that may come their way, there's absolutely no way they could have prepared for what ends up coming their way. The plan is to get them all inside and blow them up while the family hides inside an old freezer. They do their best to fend them off, and they do a great job, but in the end, there are just too many of them. When Dad does the math and realizes the addition of Charlotte means they won't all fit in the freezer, he locks his boys safely in the other room, flashes back to them as babies in his arms, and makes himself a barrier between them and the final wave of monsters. The house explodes along with Dad, and the kids get away out the back of the ATV. But this is a horror movie, and our one last hurrah sees the creatures make a final surge in the form of a furry, fiery Ferris wheel of fucked if I know. The attempt is ultimately unsuccessful, but in the 2024 world of cookie-cutter, bullshit, unoriginal horror movies, this ending was completely fucking cool, as far as I'm concerned. I mentioned this movie's similarities to 28 Days Later. A lot of people are also comparing Arcadian to A Quiet Place. And again, the trailer would have led you to believe exactly that. If you break all three of these movies down, the common denominator is they all use some sort of post-apocalyptic backdrop to demonstrate how far people are willing to go for their families. Jim Krasinski's A Quiet Place was a breakthrough film in its use of silence to heighten tension. The actual monsters were questionable at best, but the rest of the story's elements work perfectly together otherwise. story-wise. The story's strength was in the close-knit family unit and their unbreakable bond. Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later was a nearly perfect movie, in my opinion. It examined the extent the media thrusts violence in our faces, was well acted, well written, and those infected folks revolutionized the portrayal of zombies. Its strength was in the makeshift formation of a family unit from a ragtag collection of strangers who learned to work together to keep each other alive. Now, on paper, Arcadian follows the same structure and it attempts to convey the same sentiments. Paul wants to prepare his boys for manhood. If he fails, they will not survive. It's as basic a family story as anybody could write. If Arcadian fails anywhere, I think it's in the fusing of the horror and dramatic elements. I mentioned the long opening act, and some people have issues with Nicolas Cage sleeping through half of the film. If you were hoping to see the Quiet Place style movie with Nick Cage doing crazy Nick Cage things, you'd absolutely be let down. But if you went into this without presuppositions, you'd be more likely to pick up on the heavy themes of fatherhood and masculinity, because they were everywhere. I didn't watch the trailer and I enjoyed this film thoroughly, probably because I had no expectations. I didn't have expectations from Nicolas Cage either. If you've seen his movies, you know he has a very wide dramatic range. One thing though, on a personal note, a lot of online folks complained about the monsters themselves. They were weird or silly, or their physicality didn't make sense. Everyone's as entitled to their opinions as I am, and in my opinion, I've all the respect in the world for Arcadian's willingness to try something we've never seen before. Maybe these monsters were silly. Maybe people were right to laugh at them cartwheeling around the place like a stray wagon wheel set on fire. But for me, if it comes down to making a choice between something I've never seen before and one more fucking demonic nun or lipstick demon, if you've seen Arcadian, let me know which side of the divide you stand on. Personally, I loved it. In this day and age, I thought it was brilliant to see a film about fatherhood and masculinity. As always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, folks. It's me, Jonny, from that video you just loved, and I know you loved it because this book I read told me if I constantly say that to you, you will start to believe it's true. So thanks for loving that video you just watched. You're also going to love this next video as soon as you click on it. Click on it.